32 ticks following, so they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing. Snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow too will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jale kalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn?
Hello everyone, welcome to the Ake Book and Arts Festival 2020. My name is Edwin Okolo. I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, and I'm a book enthusiast. Today, I will be hosting the book conversation with Shola von Reinhold on their novel Lote. Lote is a book that is very hard to describe because it focuses on history, on magic, on identity and beauty and I guess escapism. So it took me 3 reads to really understand the book, and I'm really fascinated and excited with it, and I'm excited to discuss the book with Shola. So I would introduce them now. Shola, hi. Could you please introduce yourself to all of us?
Hi. Yeah, thank you for having me, Ake, and also for for sort of bearing through with the novel 3 times as well. It's kind of amazing. Yeah, I'm Shola. I'm a novelist based in Glasgow in Scotland. And it's my first novel, which has been published in the UK by Jacaranda Books as part of their initiative to publish 20 Black British writers in 2020, which is apparently it's the first time a UK publisher has published that many writers in sort of history, or at least that they've been able to find out. That's how Lote was published earlier this year. Obviously, it's been quite a year for a tiny publisher to publish 20 writers in a single year as well.
So to start things off, I was really, really fascinated with the world that Lote is set in, both the metaphysical world and the physical world. The Dunn residency was just because I think for every writer, every poet, every creative, residencies are a huge part of our growth process. And I was just really, really fascinated with the Dunn residency and Dunn itself and the world, that world. So what inspired the focus on the poet's life and how residencies tend to shape their worldview and their expression?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. And it's something I haven't been asked before about the book, the sort of the specifics of a residency. And I'm not really sure. I think it's a kind of ideal microcosm in which to explore lots of things. And a lot of the writing I have enjoyed and was enjoying whilst writing it was sort of organized around the principle of a kind of micro community or a microcosm. And, a residency in a town where, which is sort of quite relatively remote, is quite a sort of rich way to explore sort of whole cross section of ideas. And I don't know, I mean, I also, I was thinking of all the I've done like, how many? I think I've done 1 to 2. I've done like 2 to 3 residencies before, and they were sort of lovely, and completely different to the kind of residency that Matilda experiences in Dunn as well. So I'm not really, so whilst it's a great sort of way to explore lots of ideas, I'm also not really sure where I got the idea from originally and how that happened.
Interesting. I also felt a little cheated that the book just starts in media res, because Matilda herself is such a fascinating character that I just wanted to know everything about her, and we only get like a small window into her life, I think about a year plus. Why did you choose to, I guess, focus on such a small window, even though a lot of things happen in that small window of time? Why don't we get more of Matilda's past? Because there's so many lives, there's so many times she's escaped into new identities and new personas, and we kind of just get like a glimpse of all of that, but we don't really get full dose of Matilda and why she's the way she is and why this need to escape exists. So I guess I'm curious about that. Why pick this particular window of time?
Yeah, I guess it's useful to think about the book in terms of who's narrating it. It's primarily in first person, narrated by Matilda. So she's the one that's sort of controlling how much of her life you see. She's narrating from a sort of imagined later point. We don't quite know when that is. It could be sort of anywhere in her future. But yeah, she's the one that's doling out this sort of very fixed and controlled sense of what you see of her. I guess it relates a lot to a lot of stuff the book's playing with in terms of biography. You know, at the beginning, there's a kind of a chronology, which is typographically displayed like the kinds of biographies you see in, you know, like a Penguin Classics or an Oxford World Classics book. And this is again something that she's showing you, and we find out that she's got a very sort of complicated relationship with her own history and how much of that she wants to engage in and what she's escaping in. So I can't really give a full, like a sort of fixed answer. It's really something the reader, I guess, encounters, engages. It's an experience, experiencing a narration in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm also kind of curious about archiving. I don't think I've ever read any book where the main character's thing is archiving and exploring history through photography. And she does it as a hobby and also as an occupation at the same time. Why does she get into archiving? How does that happen? Why is she fascinated? Apart from, of course, obviously the transfictions, why is she fascinated with the idea of cataloging the past, archiving, essentially giving the past context?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it does for Matilda emerge from her transfictions, you know, and just her also just sort of her more general obsessions of aspects of history, aspects of the past. And, you know, she would have started encountering these historical personae and literary marginal figures through the internet and through books and looking at photographs on there, which is, I guess, in and of itself a kind of archiving. But for anyone that obsessed, I suppose the natural progression is would have been for her to try and find more photographs, to figure out that there's photographs which haven't been seen of this, you know, whoever this figure is, which would have led her to a photographic archive, which is the one that we sort of find her in when the novel starts. And, you know, it's from there that she starts working in archives, although she's not actually getting paid. She's getting sort of an unofficial travel fee. So it's essentially being exploited by one of the assistants in the archive as well. But she at the same time loves it because it gives her, well, this sort of exploitative wage that she's been given is sort of more money than she would have otherwise. But also it gives her access to this archive and gives her sort of greater access to this archive and to her own sort of obsessions, her transfictions, as they're called in the book, which you mentioned.
Also, I found it really funny that for somebody as expressive as Matilda is, she is also a Luddite. She doesn't really have a phone. She's not really like a computer person. She's so pleased when she gets it done that she doesn't have to deal with picking up phones or, you know, updating her life on social media or all of that. Why is Matilda so averse to technology, even though it's obvious that her obsessions with history and the transfictions and all of that most likely started through social media, because at 13, 14, there's no way you really have access to that level of historical, you know, archives or artifacts. So why is she so averse to technology?
Yeah, well, I think it's partly come through a kind of, I don't know, kind of necessity in a way, because she has been technically homeless and had no income, which means that I think she's got like a sort of little phone at the beginning, and doesn't have a laptop. She's like borrowing, when she uses the laptop, she borrows her friend, when she first sort of looks up the Dunn residency, or when she applies to it, and she uses the sort of computers in the archives. But I definitely folded in, it's always quite nice to play with when characters are researching things, when they're trying to find and figure out things. It's quite a useful tool to sort of strip back technology a little bit, but it is sort of there throughout the whole book. It's just in the background. And I guess Matilda's, I wouldn't say for sure that she has like an aversion, or maybe she does, but it's not sort of like a hatred of technology. She's just sort of not had that much opportunity to sort of use properly sort of working technology, and then she goes to the Dunn residency. And yes, definitely, like the sort of, in terms of the totality of the book, it is slightly I guess aestheticized in such a way as to reference a lot of the historical figures and literature of the sort of modernist period that she's engaging with. So it's playing with that, and it's playing with like the idea of anachronism as well.
Matilda spends a significant amount of part of the book reinventing herself. There's a Daramola, there's so many, I would say, skins that she shed before we meet her. And we meet her as Matilda, and she spends a significant part of the book trying to escape the consequences of her past selves and her past lives. Why is she so consumed with the idea of escaping and changing and shedding identities and adopting it? It's because it keeps recurring in the book. Even when she gets to Dunn residency, we don't really know who Matilda is, because she's kind of slightly adapting to the people she meets and the circumstances that she meets when she gets to Dunn. So why is there such a preoccupation with identity and changing identity and shedding identity? Why is she so preoccupied with this all through the book?
I guess there's a section where it's sort of we get a tiny glimpse into her past, the past that she's escaping from. The sort of intimations of violence and of deprivation. So we could read it as a kind of protracted, almost like spiritual or psychological flight. She's in this perpetual mode of escape. It's a kind of survival. It's a kind of survival skill. She escaped once, but then was sort of kind of unable to stop doing this, to stop shedding these identities. But there's also a way of looking at it, which is like like one of my favorite stories about Zora Neale Hurston is the fact that she removed 10 years off of her. She was 26 and she said that she was 16, I think, on her application, which allowed her to get the free education she needed, which allowed her to go on to university and get her scholarships, which sort of allowed her to do all of her writing and her, I guess, anthropological work, or sort of social history that she was doing as well. And I feel like that's like a really beautiful relation to the world, this sort of choice, this sort of like manipulation that people who are forced to often have to do in terms of their identity, just to get access to what everybody else has access to, or what a sort of default group or a privileged group have access to. I suppose there's this way in which sort of institutions and states and sort of wider structures would rather us be these kind of mono-legible static sites of information which just simply never change, and our identities are actually much more fluid than that. And then we're also forced to sometimes have to alter the surface levels of our identity to get access to certain things. So there's this sort of side of it as well, as Matilda's identity changes, as we could read them as a kind of survival technique to
I felt torn. I think that's the word I'll use. I felt torn that in Matilda's attempts to essentially access privilege, she essentially becomes a very bad person for a significant part of her life. She lies, she steals, she deceives a lot of her acquaintances in the early part of her life, which comes back to haunt her in the later parts of the book, where she's hiding from people. She's trying to minimize how much they know about her because she's afraid that someone might know somebody from one of her past lives. And I felt very torn by this because even the Dunn residency, to a certain extent, she kind of gets in through fraudulent means. And I kind of felt, does she really understand the consequences of her actions? Does she understand that while it's valid that she needs to survive and she needs to, move up in the world and access a better life, there are people who are suffering or people who have to bear the consequences of her ambition. How did you reconcile all of that when you were writing Lot?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question. But I think I disagree that anybody's actually suffering through Matilda's actions. If you look at the kind of places that she's stealing from, if you look at the people, the social groups she's moving through, if you look at the Dunn residency, they're all incredibly elitist institutions or corrupt spaces or essentially lots of things organized upon the basis of the kind of social oppression that Matilda experiences as a black woman, a black working class woman. Even the social groups that she moves through, who's actually getting hurt and who's actually getting exploited. It seems to me that all of those groups were they were either friends of Matilda because they thought she was somebody different, or they wanted to be friends with her because these are also, predominantly white middle class or upper middle class groups, and they wanted some kind of proximity to her race. And she ultimately comes out with not very much, and they are all exactly where they are, including the Dunn residency, which we find out is a residency which is founded on all sorts of incredibly messed up relations to the world.
Okay, so I asked that question because I was also kind of partly triggered myself in the course of my life and growing and moving through social classes. I've kind of realized that I'm able to do all of this because I have a certain level of social currency. I'm able to walk into a room and essentially mimic the social cues that elitist people use to determine who is in their social class or not. And it's obvious that the only way Matilda was really able to move through these social circles without getting caught or getting exposed is because she also carries a lot of social currency, probably because of her interest in history and because of her interest in beauty. How does this idea of social currency, especially now that it's a lot easier for us to meet people because of social media and because of, I guess, mutual interests, how does Matilda navigate social currency as a tool for her in the book?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, she does it in various ways. Just like I referenced the Zora Neale Hurston taking 10 years off of her age, Matilda engages with her identity in very similar ways. But actually, then we have to ask how much social currency does she manage to acquire as someone that has very little, has come into the world with very little, because it's suggested by, from the previous groups that she does get caught. They do realize that she's not who she's presenting herself as, or who they want her to be. And so there's that sense that she's also escaping the successive realizations of these groups, which have been ultimately exploiting her because of who they think that she is. But at the same time, there is, I guess, a scrutiny of the levels of, just as you say, the levels of just the fact that she's able to do that, even though it's a very much acquired, these are acquired skills which she's not supposed to have, or, no one has taught her. There is, there's a bit where her and Erskine Lily have gone to shoplift a luxury supermarket, which we find out has been exploiting its workers, many of whom are immigrants. There's a bit where the workers have to go back to their job and working these horrible hours, and they've been forced into accommodation, sort of maxed out accommodation, whilst sort of Erskine, Lily, and Matilda get to go back to Dunn and sort of enjoy the food and drinks that they've stolen. So there's a question about the sort of levels and the sort of, I guess, lack of awareness of privilege, and of which one is able to sort of acquire or move through, even if just momentarily. And the fact that there are levels of doing this, and that someone that's maybe from, someone that's acquired these things in certain ways as survival techniques often, well, not often actually, but occasionally can create a kind of the kind of flight, the kind of fear mode that Matilda's in, and Erskine Lily as well, can stop people being able to see a little wider, but not always as well. It's incredibly variable.
So it's interesting that you're talking about this, because there's an article from BuzzFeed. I think it was released 2016-ish. It's called "We Are the Urban Poor," and it kind of radicalized me. And when I was reading Lote, I thought about that essay a lot, because Matilda and Erskine Lily both perform this ritual. I would call it a ritual, where they know that they are low on cash. They know that they are on the edge, especially for Matilda. She's always on the edge, because anything could go wrong and stipend would be revoked and she would be kicked out of the Dunn residency. And it seems like in that kind of situation, the first thing you would do would be self-preservation, like saving a significant amount of the money, eating frugally, all sorts of things. But Erskine Lily and Matilda spend almost all their time, I guess, keeping up with the other residents at the Dunn residency. They eat expensively. They seem to focus a lot of their time and their energies on keeping up appearances and essentially matching luxury for luxury, vice for vice, the other residents at the Dunn residency. So why did you choose to explore this idea of young millennials or post-millennials, Generation Z, knowing that a certain lifestyle is the only way they have access to continue to move in certain circles, even though it's detrimental to them in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term?
Yeah, I think it's just what happens a lot of the time. For people often don't choose the sort of most stable option, I guess, I don't know if that's quite the right word I meant. But I guess I was also thinking about the sort of mirror between, Matilda and Erskine Lily, who are from considerably disadvantaged backgrounds to everybody on the residency. And they spend a huge amount of their time pursuing a kind of opulence and a vision of romance and pleasure and luxury. Although I'd say it's luxury with, the book's definition of luxury is not so much capitalist luxury, even though they do sort of try to they do have an attachment to capitalist luxury. But at the same time, the residents are from these quite wealthy backgrounds. They're sort of mostly upper middle class people who actually spend a lot of the time, experiencing kind of class guilt, are self-abnegating, are in this sort of state of self-denial, and sort of also kind of pretending not to have this kind of wealth. And I was interested in the sort of balance between, you see a lot in the UK, and especially in arts institutions, you have a lot of wealthy people pretending not to be wealthy, whereas like Erskine, Lily, and Matilda are actually just enjoying themselves to an extent. You know, Matilda's got the stipend, which she's like burning through, and she's never had that much money in her life. It's just this sort of moment of, oh my God, let's just like absolutely embrace this kind of opulence. Yeah.
Okay. So the book really kicks off when Matilda steals that picture of Hermia Druitt. The mood changes. She seems to finally have a focus. Why is that moment so pivotal to the entire book?
Yeah, I guess that moment is actually kind of, you could think of it as a kind of political act. She's stealing from a sort of huge institution, sort of one of the biggest galleries in the world. But if she hadn't stolen that photograph would have been either buried in the archive for forever, or it would have been destroyed, because there's a bit where one of the other archival assistants finds a second, there's two photographs, and one of which she steals and one of which sort of stays back at in the archives, and one of the assistants finds it and says, this isn't a photograph from the 20s, this is a modern photograph, because he is having a kind of cognitive dissonance in seeing this image of a black woman in Britain in the 20s at this sort of kind of like artistic bohemian party, and just decides that it's a kind of costume photograph from the 1990s or something like that. And if Matilda hadn't taken that action, that sort of piece of history would have been lost forever. And it's a kind of it's just this like hugely important idea of having, Matilda's being there. Matilda's just having a black woman like Matilda in that archive allowed for this kind of erasure to pause, even if it's just for the time that Matilda's struggling against it. But yeah, so yeah, I guess to answer your question, I'd say it's because it's a kind of political act.
Maliki. I was really, really moved by the relationship between Maliki and Matilda, because they are really good for each other. Like, Maliki is kind of like a grounding force for Matilda. He's there for her. He rescues her a number of times when she's flailing in her quest to escape. But they also both know that continued contact between the two of them will eventually lead to both of them failing in their attempts to escape their former lives and move into a more socially stable, economically stable life. So it dilemma of this black person who understands me, who understands my situation, who loves me, I would say to some extent, I have to let them go if I am going to succeed. But I also want them to succeed. And I'm invested in their success, because the more people like me who enter into these social circles and become successful, the more they clear the path for me. So why did you choose to explore this, I would say, between the devil and the deep blue sea situation in the relationship between Matilda and Malachi? I was really curious about that.
Yeah, I feel like it goes back into like the like protracted like psychological flight that they're both undergoing. Like, they both remind each other of what they are trying to escape, and they're also just like both incredibly sort of like overly dramatic and a little bit superstitious, and they make this kind of, them not being able to see each other anymore. It's a kind of like contract that they've made with the universe. If we both give up this sort of like love for each other, they're like sort of more like siblings than anything. If they give themselves sort of one another up, that the contract is that they will be able to sort of experience and encounter. Also, it's not even so much that they are trying to access like this like wealth and privilege. It's actually more like they're trying to escape what they're trying to flee from, and they escape into like various different circles and like scenes. And so yeah, it definitely it's this thing, and it's also just this thing of like not, this a very human thing of pushing away what's like what the best thing is for you. At the end, there's like suggestion that that they've possibly managed to escape that as well towards the end of the novel.
Mathilda and Agnes share a lot of similarities in their fascination with forgotten Black artists and creators from the 19th and 20th century. However, they express this fascination in vastly different ways. Agnes is militant at this point. She will steal art that she considers valuable, even though the galleries don't consider them valuable, even though these galleries, despite the fact that they don't prioritize art by Black creators, they will still punish anyone who takes that art and values it. While Mathilda is more of a curiosity for her, even though eventually Agnes kind of radicalizes her, but they have these very different approaches to protecting Black art from the 19th and 20th century. They have very different approaches to how this art should be preserved and how this art should be engaged. I was curious about that, like this juxtaposition of militancy versus, I would say, escapist curiosity. Why did you choose to explore this way?
Yeah, I think that's like a really interesting comparison between the two. Well, it was important to have that cross-generational representation. Agnes, through Agnes, we can see that like not only are these historical figures like Hermia being erased over and over and over again, but also like the people that are trying to liberate or recover or uncover these historical Black figures, the actual people doing the work to do this uncover, they're also being erased. People like Agnes, who we see has been doing this recovery work for like several decades by the point that we encounter her. So there was like this sort of differences in relationship came out through this sort of it was showing a kind of generational difference, I suppose, on the one hand. On the other hand, it was important to have two Black women working on the same thing with all of these overlaps, but like establish the fact that like they're incredibly different people. I didn't sort of really do it that consciously, but retrospectively, I was thinking about it a lot in terms of how much that I feel like it's very, in the UK, like just to have like representation of this kind, like it was not something I could find in books, in terms of like representation of Black women. And then to have, you usually just have like one Black character, and then if you have two, they have to be incredibly different. So having these two people interested in these incredibly sort of like overlapping things and yet still establish a difference, I guess, is always like an important thing that I've been thinking about. But yeah, do you know?
Yeah, so because I was like, Agnes is badass. Like she is badass. She's like, get me my drink, get me my art. I'm keeping it. Like there's nothing you can do. I'll keep it. And she was like a very, very interesting contrast to Erskine Lily, because where Agnes is very serious and very focused, Erskine is more of I think he's like a misguided mentor for Mathilda. He indulges her, vices. He has the same interest in the luxuries and the lottos, and he essentially pushes her to explore these ideas that she has. He doesn't question her transfictions. He introduces her to Orion, and kind of makes her a bit of an alcoholic. And so I'm kind of like, he's like the most fascinating version of what Mathilda could be if she completely gave up on any kind of respectability or any kind of conformity. So I just wanted to know how that character came to you and how they evolved into the person that they became by the end of the book.
Yeah, I feel like Ask and Lily just sort of like appeared and they come like quite late into the book and they just sort of like walked into the novel. And I was like, oh, okay, here's this like a character. And it's something sort of made a lot of sense. And to me, it's like actually one of like, it's like the romance of the book. There aren't any sort of like traditional romances. There are no like, it's like, it's a friendship. I was, I guess interested in like what happens when you privilege this kind of friendship above like a kind of heteronormative romance, whether it's queer or not. Yeah, I guess like Ask and Lily is in some ways like Matilda's alter ego, or just just ego. And in some ways she indulges and is like a bad mentor for Ask and Lily as much as Ask and Lily is for Matilda. They're very like on like even sort of like pegging in terms of like encouraging each other, like misleading each other. I guess like it ultimately is just like a kind of romance that they're both having. It's like a romance, a friendship-based romance, if that makes sense.
I was kind of thrown by the fact that Erskine betrays Mathilda in the end of the book. And I was also kind of, I would say, disappointed because they are such an open and, carefree character. That whole subplot of having these homosexual relationships that they don't really explore, like it happens, but it's something that they're not willing to, I would say, explore. It kind of caught me off guard. I didn't expect that at all from a character like them. Why do they still have those hang-ups? Why do they still feel like they have to show some loyalty to the status quo, even though they've already kind of given up on everything else and chosen to live such self-possessed life?
I'd say actually they don't have any of those hang-ups ultimately, but Ask and Lily is being, I guess, manipulated by the person that they're having a relationship with, who is sort of manipulating various people throughout the book. So they're actually, I guess, in a lot of ways, experiencing interpersonal oppression, which maybe would explains the sort of like betrayal a lot more. We would like definitely call it a betrayal, like because I guess in some senses it is, but then I would also say to look at, at the very end of the book, there's like a character that Matilda meets, and that could be interpreted as being Ask and Lily, under a new name like Matilda, with a kind of new identity, and it could be also perceived as like a kind of final escape for both of them. So yeah,
I don't know if it's deliberate or accidental, but Lote at its core explores a concept that is gaining a lot of popularity in Black creative and professional communities, something that is called Black mid or Black mediocrity. There's a celebration of Black mediocrity because being a Black person in a multicultural world, we're expected to only bring excellence to the table. But more and more people are saying, you know what, my average should be enough. My okay should be enough. I don't want to have to be excellent. I don't want to have to be perfect to be accepted. And I think Mathilda, for most of the book and the entirety of the residency, is committed to Black mid. She doesn't even pretend to care about the residency. She doesn't pretend to read the books. When they ask her to submit the white paper book, I can't remember the full phrase. She essentially just goes and steals somebody else's work, which turns out coincidentally to be, I think, one of Hermia's poems. And she just steals that and substitutes that for her own work. And so I want to ask, this idea of Black mid, where excellence is not the default for, especially for a lead character in a novel about Black people. What are you trying to say with this?
I think I definitely was actually. I think I was definitely thinking about, thinking around like the idea of Black excellence when I was writing it, and I've been thinking about it a lot since. There's been like lots of sort of debates and conversations and arguments around like things like Black as King, and around like Beyonce and artists like Beyonce more generally, and their relation to like the notion of Black excellence. And I was thinking about it in terms of like a lot of the historical figures that I was researching whilst writing Lote, and even more recently, I was looking at a figure from the same period as Hermia, a singer called Florence Mills, who was part of like the Blackbird review that toured like Europe, and Florence Mills lived in London, and was like one of the most famous women and in the world. And this is before she died, I think, before Josephine Baker became huge as well. And I actually see sort of like Florence Mills and Josephine Baker and Beyonce as part of like a similar narrative, a similar lineage. And Florence Mills would do things like she would drive up and down London, redistributing her wealth to the poor, and she was tapped into a lot of like the Black activist networks and communist networks and Pan-African networks that were there in the UK at this time. And so in so many ways, she's this definition of Black excellence. And yeah, I was thinking of there's a kind of tug of war between two kinds of narrative. One is like the narrative which is like the validity and importance of these stories of people like Florence Mills, but also like in contemporary terms, like the narrative, the empowerment that, say, like something like Black as King gives to like the African diaspora around the world. But then pulling against that is like the idea that these narratives are exceptionalists. They are privileging like the individual above like the communities, masses of people, and also like the way that these like narratives are used to say things like, okay, so if these people could do it, if these people like Florence Mills and Josephine Baker and Beyonce can sort of like rise above so much which has been set against them, then like everybody else can. So then we like counteract that with like a narrative which is like, uplifting communal stories of communities, stories of just completely different ways of thinking about history. But then like the other tug of like, tug of the rope is that like then, but by then doing that, perhaps we are then losing these like amazing stories of Black women and the like incredible things that they've done, the way that they've navigated these like hideous power structures as well. So there's like this ongoing tug of war, and I feel like maybe the like solution, or it's not quite a solution, is like what we can tease out of them are kind of like these blueprints of people throughout history who have like navigated these social structures and resisted them. Yet each time these like narratives are cut off, like, Florence Mills' story was like erased for like a very long time until lots of people started doing recovery work into it. And if that work hadn't been done, we wouldn't know this like amazing, we wouldn't have all of this knowledge of like navigating oppressive like patriarchal power structures in this way. And so, yeah, I guess what I'm saying is hopefully we can tease out kind of blueprints from these stories instead of thinking of them as just like excellent narratives.
So I'll just talk about Matilda's transfictions because they're a huge plot point for the book. They bear a lot of similarities to, Orisha worship. The idea that you can be mounted by an ancestor or a spirit and experience their lives, even though you have never met them, and you kind of are inspired and guided by these ancestors or these spirits, which is partly what happens to Matilda, because by the time she gets to Dunn residency, she finds out that most of the visions she'd seen as a teenager were actually about people who she follows in their path. So could you shed some more light on the idea of Matilda's transfictions? Are they truly paranormal, or are they just an extension of her imagination, or are they just a route for her to escape the horrific life that she had in her youth? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful analogy to like Orisha worship, and they could be interpreted as something spiritual or something magical or something deeply psychological. For me, they are like, actually, I guess they are uncategorized. They can't be categorized in actually sort of like in any of those, and they don't map on fully to any of those terms. There's something which are like a lot more fluid and which are a lot more like, I guess it was a way of trying to like document like one of like the many ways which like various people experience the world, which we don't quite have like terminology for or language for. So I'd say like, yes, they could be read in those ways, and that's like fine, but also like they bleed out into like various other things and sort of exceed all of those terms that I listed, like the magical or the psychological or the spiritual. So I mean, to answer your question, it's like I don't really have an answer for what the transfictions are.
Okay. I am also really fascinated with the luxuries because I'm a huge mythology fan, and I've kind of come across the concept of lot of the luxuries as a subsection of the angels, and I kind of was very happy to see it in this book, to see it explored, to see that the luxuries are actually predominantly Black, and they are focused on beauty and expressions of beauty, and I would say the appreciation and the propagation of beauty in the world and also in the spirit realm. Why did you choose to explore this mythological concept?
Yeah. So I guess I've always been actually really interested in like angel lore and like Enochian magic and the representation of, the sort of transformation of winged intermediary spirits, which like sort of exist in multiple religions, from like Buddhism to Zoroastrianism, I think, as well. And there's like also like the Assyrian genii, the ancient Greek genii, also like the Renaissance putti, the winged spirits, which became like the cherub, which obviously like cherubs in like biblical terms didn't look anything like those like little winged babies. But yeah, I was fascinated by like this representation of like the winged figure, which could either be, which is either like an intermediary, a messenger, like Iris as well in Hermes in Greek mythology, or sometimes exist outside of those categories, or exist like not just as messengers, but as like just some other kind of spiritual force, or as like some other kind of god. And I was interested in like creating like a sort of minor apocrypha sort of myth, and thinking about like the representation of like the contemporary or like modern representation of like the angel, which is like usually always like white and blonde, and like clearly for like most of like history, these winged figures have not been that. And then at the same time, I was like, it also always been like fascinated by like the myth of the Lotus Eaters in like Homer's Odyssey, and the bit where Odysseus and his men find this island, which, as I mentioned in Lote, is like sometimes placed as being somewhere in West Africa, somewhere off of West Africa, and the land of the Lotus Eaters, and the men. He sends 2 of his men out to go and to go scout the island, and then it's like just this really luxurious place where they sit and eat the lotus fruit all day, and it's possibly a little bit narcotic as well. And Odysseus drags his men back in because they need to go back home. And I just felt like how boring of Odysseus to like force his men to leave like this like glorious like party place, which is, it looked to me like a kind of like proto-communist society where like everybody has what they need, but like actually more than that, everybody has like access to pleasure. And so I started thinking more and more about this, like, and the Lotus Eaters bit is just like a very small bit in the Homer's Odyssey, and it's just started thinking more and more about it, and it sort of started like generating its own mythology and interweaving with like the angel lore and like the Enochian sort of like magical histories that I'd been looking into, and then also things like the representation of, also thinking about like the angelic in terms of gender. The angel is always represented as an androgynous figure or described as an androgynous figure, and how in like alchemy there was like the divine androgyne or the alchemical angel who is like also either androgynous or like some other configuration of like we could think of it as like a non-binary sex or gender, and the luxuries are kind of combination of weaving of all of those things when they appear in Lote.
I have like 2 questions left. The first is about the Dunn residency. For me, it felt very much like an institution that was originally created to do a certain thing, and by the time Mathilda joins the residency, the original purpose is completely gone. The people who are at the residency at that point have no idea about the history of the residency, what it mattered, why it mattered to the people who originally created it, and what it was supposed to do. But they continue, and these are extremely educated, extremely privileged people. They continue to sustain this institution with no idea of why it was created, with no idea that all their efforts are completely useless, because the archive, the residency promotes abnegation, which is to forgo everything, luxury, enjoyment, enlightenment, in service of its twisted ideals. Why did you choose to explore this idea of institutions existing for no reason, like completely losing the plot? They continue to exist and persist because of privilege, nothing else.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I feel like you just answered it. Just the way that institutions like this can just keep on going and keep on, they're like self-propagating just with like enough money. This is what happens.
So for my final question, it goes back to Mathilda, because by the time Mathilda returns to the Dunn residency, it feels like her life has gone full circle. She's found purpose, her transfictions have been validated, she's essentially rescued Hermia's work from erasure and obscurity, and she is in a very, very good place as a researcher, a person. She's very happy, she's very settled. So it was kind of bittersweet for me that after everything, she still feels the need to escape one more time and reinvent herself as Hermia. And for me, it felt a little bit like she was erasing Hermia to take her place, and that everything that had happened to her over the course of the book, she still was deeply dissatisfied with who she was. And I guess I just wanted to shed a bit of light on that, why she chose to keep up the charade of reinventing herself. I wouldn't call it, okay, let me not call it a charade, because it feels real to her. So why she still feels the need, despite the fact that she's achieved so much, she's done so much, she has respect and validation, she still feels the need to escape at the end of the book.
I think there's like a few ways in which we could like see that. Like one is like she's stepping into like this title of Hermia, like Hermia as like a kind of ritualistic title, like Hermia was a high priestess of like the Lotos, the society which she founded, and Hermia wasn't necessarily Hermia's birth name. You know, she may have chosen, just like Matilda, may have like gone through various other identities and names, and so to Matilda, she could see it as like a kind of final assumption of this like of this position, and also like a final escape. It's like a kind of last, it's like her one last escape, because she's like sort of achieved everything she's wanted to. But we could also read it actually as like, we don't know if she's going to stop escaping there. She may continue assuming new identities, because possibly for her, escape has become inescapable in and of itself. And that's, I guess, like a kind of, maybe it's like a question which is posed at the end of the book. So I wouldn't like give a definite answer as to like if to what quite she's doing, to what she's quite doing with that. Yeah.
I guess that's a question I'll have to answer myself eventually.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Shola, for having this conversation with me. It's been very enlightening, because I feel that for me, Lote kind of opens a new vista of possibilities for African and Black writers, where we don't have to write about poverty or pain and suffering. Like, Matilda was predominantly somebody who was given to enjoyment, and she was unapologetic about it, because we do a lot of like scrounging and saving as middle class or disadvantaged Black people. But Hermia completely rejected all of that and just forged her own path. And somehow she managed to get everything she wanted, in spite of everything that was, poised against her achieving her goals, or validating her transfections. And I just was really fascinated and inspired by that. Thank you so much for writing such a fascinating book. And I hope that you all who are watching go and buy a copy, because you really need to get into this world. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was, and for like your questions and sort of investment into the story as well.
Stranger's Guide is not a typical American travel magazine. Our mission is to dive deep into a single location, commissioning work from great writers and photographers, famous individuals, as well as up-and-coming new voices. This year, we decided to go to Lagos. And we are proud of the volume we produced, with original work from some of Nigeria's best writers and photographers, working with luminaries like Wale Soyinka, Molara Wood, and Femi Kute. We think this is a very special volume, and we're so excited to bring it back to Lagos.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words. When it seems like I'm nowhere to be found, if you look, you'll find me in a book. Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book.
We don't just think of ourselves as a bank. We think of ourselves as corporate citizens with responsibility for growing the economy. Reading and education is a key part of it. But equally important is having access to reading materials at home. A lot of the intervention we've done throughout this COVID is to ensure that people can safely navigate the uncertainties of the COVID crisis and come out of it ready for, to live again.
Let's take a ride to the past on the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon.
The dreams that we have are limited by what we have directly interacted with. What reading does is it makes it possible for you to begin to live in worlds that don't yet exist. One read creates a discipline of reading. One read puts me on a timeline. It gives me an important book and I have an opportunity to read it and to collaborate. It's almost like having someone who does your book selection for you. If you have editors and people who are really good at this saying to you, this is the book for the month, I value that. I want to be able to read in a community. I want reading to be a collaborative thing. I want reading to be a communing, and One Read allows me to do that. I will use One Read any day, anytime.
I was very excited when I got the call because it's a new frontier. Every chance to create is beautiful, and so to have the opportunity to create a theme song for something I actually care about, it's a perfect combination.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words.
First, create a melody. Melodies are usually what make songs, as they say, sweet, and so that is where I started from. I tried to find something that merged the folk sound I'm used to, but also sprinkle a bit of the African spirit in there.
Then it seems like I'm nowhere to be found. If you look, you'll find me in a book.
With the lyrics for the songs, a lot of times when I was younger, when you didn't find me anywhere, I was very likely in my room reading a book.
Let's take a ride to the past on the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon.
Reading is a big part of my person, and I'm also a writer, so it all just comes together. The best thing about reading, and what's really important about it, is that it helps us become who we should be. With reading, we become many things. We become empathetic to people. Stories that are not ours, we get to experience, and I feel like that is one thing that makes you a well-rounded human being.
You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the word in a book.
It's extremely important to read the work of other African writers that are not Nigerian or from my nationality, because it's a beautiful mix of finding home and visiting a new place, all in one.
Never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the word in a book.
One Read is an app I will use.
That 5 minutes madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.
Sticky, spicy, sweet.
Don't touch me! I will get you arrested!
Very, very easy.
Relax, everybody!
He shot you!